Welcome students to the Assessment Theory Unit 1 video. In this video we'll be focusing on assessment theory in general and we'll also be looking at the learning theory. So this first video is a bit of a recap of what we've done in terms of the module overview, and then we'll look at a little bit around the principles and process of assessment, and the second video will then focus on the learning theories. So again, what is assessment? So I found this very vague definition of assessment. The reason I chose it was because I would like to make a point. You'll read many texts, you'll watch many videos, you'll speak to many people, and everybody will give you a different opinion, a different idea, a different thought around what assessment is. It's very important then that you create your own idea of assessment. After you read the many texts, the many excerpts, you watch many videos, you look at what websites or blogs say, you listen to your colleagues, you need to understand what assessment is for you. Why do you assess? There's obviously an imperative in terms of a national expectation, a district expectation, a school expectation. But you as the teacher will need to decide what your reason is for assessing, and only that will then establish how you go about assessing your learners, irrespective of following the curriculum or following what the school says you need to do. What you then do with that idea of assessment and that practice around assessment comes from your belief in why children need to be assessed. Again, these are the definitions that I included in the overview video. I chose them, as I said, because they're quite comprehensive and they somewhat support my reasons or my idea around assessment. Mine goes a little bit further in that I believe that assessment is to support the learner in their progress towards reaching their potential, and I think that assessment should be a very easy, non-threatening practice within the classroom space. And so to get there for me is around helping learners understand that assessment shouldn't feel threatening, it shouldn't feel scary. And so that's how I start to develop my idea around assessment. And hopefully you, through this module, will start to develop your own idea around assessment and end up with something that makes you feel comfortable when you have to explain what assessment is and when you obviously have to do it within the school spaces that you find yourself. So as I said, starting with the why, the purpose is extremely important for me. I need to ask myself the question, why am I assessing my students? This is the starting point, and this is really what helps you to establish how your assessment will be designed, how it will be communicated to your students, and what the use of the outcomes will then be. It's important because you need to understand that we want to improve our learners' progress. We want to improve what they are doing, and this will only be done by feedback that we receive through the assessment process. And this assessment could be formative or summative. It could be in a very organized manner. It could be in a very easy manner, a manner that you hadn't expected to work. And of course, it can be in a formal or informal way as well. And the next point is how to assess. So it's very important to choose appropriate assessment methods. The method should meet, or rather the method should ensure that you meet your criteria in terms of what you're wanting to assess and to see how well students have achieved the intended outcomes. So it's important that you assess during the course and not only on the end, or rather not only at the end. The reason we assess throughout the course is to establish if practices that are currently in place are working, or whether they need to be tweaked in order for the end result to be more appropriate. And then lastly, what? So the content of assessment tasks should be aligned with the intended learning outcomes. So the student needs to see that they are being assessed in a manner that meets or is aligned with what they should be learning and what the outcome should then be. So again, remember, you read different texts, you speak to different people, you will learn different things. So I've used the Northern Ireland Education Department document, which talks about 4 main purposes of assessment. Now, in various texts, you'd find the same thing, and then again in other texts, you'd find something different. But I found that this suited what we needed to be focusing on within this module. So they talk about assessment having 4 main purposes. First of which is diagnostic assessment, and so the purpose of this is to establish where the learner is when they begin the module. So it's right at the beginning of the learning process, and the teacher is very involved in this because you need to establish what does the learner already know. Do they come with any prior knowledge or any prior learning? So the word diagnostic gives you an indication of what it's about. You're diagnosing, for lack of a better way of saying it, where the child is. Are they on par? Are they perhaps behind what the expectation is? We never say a child is really behind. Generally, it's just we accept where the child is at and help them move to the next part of where they need to be. But in terms of a diagnostic assessment, it does help you to establish at what level is this learner, or are you finding this learner. Beyond this, diagnostic assessment can also take place in different parts of the learning process, but always perhaps at the beginning of a unit. And this is just to keep, quote unquote, diagnosing where the student or the child is. It's also very helpful for finding out about student difficulties, things like barriers to learning difficulties, and it also helps you to establish if the child needs any type of support. We then look at formative assessment, which is assessment for learning, and it's a continuous process. The reason it is continuous is because you'll be looking at how the learner is progressing, if they have been progressing. So really it is to determine how close they are or how well they are meeting the criteria of the course. It takes place in order for the teacher to know when things need to be tweaked. It takes place to establish if the child is comfortable or able to deal with the content that they are being presented with. Summative assessment, I think this is the one we are usually most comfortable with, and summative assessment looks at the overall performance. So you really understand and establish that what progress the learner has made, and this usually takes place at the end of the learning cycle, and it helps you to establish, has this learner met the criteria, met the learning outcomes, have they been supported? And remember, I'm saying this specifically because we talk about the learner achieving goals, but our job is to support the learner to achieve those goals. So at the end of the learning cycle, when you do complete a summative assessment, as a teacher, you should be looking at yourself and thinking or saying, have I supported this learner sufficiently to enable them to meet the outcomes as planned at the beginning of the learning cycle? And then evaluative assessment. This really focuses on accountability, and it helps to inform planning for next learning cycle. So this is the information that usually the Department of Education would require. This is the information that the school would use for reporting purposes and overall assessment of learner outcomes and learner achievement. And teachers use this information to really inform planning, inform curriculum planning, inform greater assessment planning to establish how far learners have progressed overall. And so this mark, while it is this assessment achievement, while it is very important, we should shift from thinking that it's the most important just because we've placed value on it, like having a big matric exam where everything you've kind of done for 12 years comes to a point. Rather, we should be focusing a little bit more on the rest of the assessment types in order to make learners feel more confident and to help them not become overwhelmed when they get to the evaluative assessment part. So what does this all mean? For me, and from what I have gathered from all the research that I've done on assessment, is that assessment is not just about marks. Assessment rather is the mechanism that really gives teachers an idea of how they can improve their teaching methods, how they can help students, how they can guide and motivate students, and how they can be involved in the learner becoming involved in their own learning process. Because we want learners to be hands-on, we want learners to be excited about their learning process. And assessment should then not scare them away from doing this, but rather should allow them to feel confident in achieving the next stepping stone and the next stepping stone until they get to the point where they feel that they have progressed in a way that makes them feel proud of themselves. I also feel that it's important for us to remember that assessment should be feedback for both the learner and the educator, not just thinking that the learner is the one that is being quote-unquote tested. But the learner should feel that through this process of assessment, I'm understanding my learning process, I'm understanding where I'm stuck and struggling, and it should actually help them to understand why am I struggling, what is my learning style, do I have any barriers, do I have any areas that I'm quite weak at, and they can then work towards changing those areas. Likewise, assessment should also be feedback for teachers or educators to understand where am I not reaching the child? Where am I at a point where I need to change my teaching strategy and give feedback in such a way that it improves the child's experience of the learning rather than making the child feel that they don't know what's happening or they can't grasp the content. Therefore, assessment should drive student learning. Students should be able to get into learning in such a way that their curiosity is ignited. So we need to use methods that are inspiring. If we only use assessment methods that are factual and knowledge-based, so they have to memorize, then we run the risk of working on very superficial learning methods or rote learning. So they just have to memorize the content, memorize enough facts and information to meet the very superficial type of learning processes that we're putting in place. We need to avoid this, and we need to have assessment practices that really gets the learner thinking. It intrigues them. It makes them want to do more research. Again, different authors and different institutions talk about different types of principles for assessment. So I've looked at the Durham University assessment principles. I've also looked at what is identified by the Northern Ireland Education Department, and then some experience and through reading and through thinking about my own process, I've also added some that I feel are important too. So let's look at the first part over here. Validity and reliability are two very important parts of assessment. Validity refers to whether the assessment actually tests what it says it tests, whereas reliability looks at if you perform that same test a number of times, will you get the same outcome? So those outcomes need to be comparable. So reliability is a very important part of assessment, as is validity. I really agree with this next one, with assessment being equitable. We need to establish practices that allow various learning styles and learning abilities to be fairly and equally tested. We know that different learners learn differently, they understand things differently, they're able to show their potential in different ways, and it is up to us as educators to ensure that the assessment is done in an equitable manner. I'll speak about this a little more when I come to suiting the learner's capabilities. Assessment should also be explicit and transparent. They should not leave any room for confusion. They should not be trying to trick a learner, and that is why I feel very strongly about the rubrics and clear assessment instructions. It should not get to a point where a learner is sitting there not understanding exactly what they're supposed to do because the instructions and because the rubric is very confusing and leaves a lot of room for interpretation, which puts the learner at a uncomfortable and difficult point. Assessment should further support the learning process. It should be efficient and have outcomes that are monitored for enhancement purposes. And so this is to help educators or teachers to actually improve on the learning process and to tweak things where it is necessary. And assessment should have committed staff. And so staff should really buy into assessment. They should really feel that it's making a difference in the learner's life and it's not just being done for purposes of ticking a box. If we look at the Northern Ireland Education Department, look into assessment, they talk about assessment being complementary and supportive of learning, again valid and reliable, fit for purpose. It should be manageable, so it shouldn't overwhelm the learner. It should support the teacher's professional judgment and, of course, supporting accountability. So after reading all of this and going into to definitions of assessment and looking at the principle of assessment, I agree with what I've included here, but I'd also like to include a few. I feel that assessment can be fun. Oftentimes, learners, especially in the intermediate phase, can be assessed in a way that gets them involved with their peers, allows them to have fun, allows them to be creative, and allows them to feel that they are not being assessed, but rather that they are engaging in further learning. Assessment for me should also build confidence. Learners shouldn't feel that they are being placed in a under a microscope to the point that they are squirming and feel overwhelmed and anxious, and that they just feel as if they're being threatened in the space. It should build their confidence. So assessment should be done in easy, manageable little blocks so that the child starts building towards the bigger assessment. And by the time they get to that point, they should feel so confident in their abilities that the assessment practices do not overwhelm them. I strongly believe in assessment suiting the learner's style. At the intermediate phase, it's quite easy to do this. Obviously, you need to commit to the curriculum expectations and the school expectations, but we can allow learners to submit for assessments in various ways. So, for example, when I work with younger learners, I often will give them the opportunity to choose how they would like to be assessed. So, for example, if they have a project on the ocean, I would give them the opportunity to decide, would they like to do an oral, would they like to do a presentation, a video, a PowerPoint, would they like to build a mini aquarium like model. They then are able to choose what they would like to do. And it's really a good way for you to get to know your learner. You have the one set of criteria that they need to adhere to. So that's basically, do they understand what the ocean is? Do they understand the different parts of the ocean? Do they know which animals are in the... So the criteria remains the same, but the way they display their ability can be shifted and changed according to what they feel more comfortable with. In this way, you're building their confidence. You're allowing them to have some type of autonomy. They feel more confident because they are engaging in a learning and assessment style that suits their particular abilities, their particular set of abilities. And of course, it still allows the assessment to be completed. So there isn't really a downside to this type of assessment type. The only real, let's call it, difficulty would be that you don't have control around timing. So some people who are doing an oral would perhaps need more time as opposed to someone who is showing you a model that can quickly go through things. But it depends on how you manage and provide instructions, and really will create the framework within which the learners can work. Then allow your assessments to be innovative. Try new things. Think of new ways to present your instructions to learners. They should be iterative, as I said earlier, so they need to be built upon each other. They need to make sense. Oftentimes, students read something like, I don't know what this teacher wants. Does she need this? Does he want this? Is this what he's looking for? Be clear in your instructions. Be clear in your expectations. They should be authentic, and for me that means don't assess for the sake of assessing. Assess to see that your learners are with you, that they're in the car, that you haven't dropped them off in some part of the journey and they lost. Make sure that you're authentically wanting to support the learning process. And assessment should also be part of learning. It should be part of a learner assessing themselves, as I've said before, and of you as a teacher getting feedback on the learning process. So there are different ways we can consider learner progress and to look at what the progress is. And so we have a measurement criteria, we have assessments, and we have evaluation. So I'm going to be focusing on assessment and evaluation. I'm not going to read this to you. Obviously, you can read this at your own leisure. But assessment and evaluation is what we're going to be focusing on now. By now, I hope that you've completed the reading that has been uploaded to the unit on assessment and evaluation. But looking at, often educators and learners are using assessment and evaluation interchangeably, but they are not the same. Assessment is an ongoing process. It's more positive, it's more individualized, it is a valuable process, and it provides feedback according to the model that I'm presenting here. Evaluation, on the other hand, is at the end of the learning cycle. It really looks at the overall outcomes. As it says, it provides closure. It is quite judgmental because it's very specific to a very strict and rigid set of criteria and standards, and it basically just shows the shortfalls. It doesn't leave room for improvement as assessment does, because it is right at the end once everything is completed, and it's not a continuous assessment type of process. But they do have some similarities. So both require criteria, of course. They do use measures, and they are evidence driven. So you need to provide reasons for why you are providing that achievement level. Again, I want to read this to you, but I found this to be a really lovely example from the Sinclair Community College document that I will upload for you as well to read. It's just an interest read, really, but it really provides a really great. I've extracted this table about assessment and evaluation because I find it to be a really good example of how they differ, how assessment differs from evaluation. So I want to read this to you, but please do go through it to really grasp the difference between the two. So at the end of the day, assessment outcomes should be used in a healthy and informative manner. They should look at answering questions like, at what level are my pupils now? Where do they need to be next? And what is the best way to help me get them there? So the me should be an important part that should be added there. How do you as the educator use the information that you've received through the assessment process to allow your learners to move to the next level in their learning process? How do you develop that strategy to help them step from where they are to where they need to be? So this is really just a snapshot into assessment. As we go along, as I've said before, we're going to be building on this quite a bit. But you need to start working on your personal definition of assessment, understanding where you are with assessment, and understanding why you assess. It will really make a big difference in the way you interact with the learners that you are guiding and supporting in the learning process. These are a list of the references I used. You are welcome to peruse them and add to them if you feel that there's other information that should be included in this video or in this unit.